All right, y'all, we are picking up where we left off from class today or yesterday if you're watching this tomorrow on Wednesday. Oh, time is such an interesting concept. Anyhow, starting off with some visuals. So, what do we see here? Right here on the left, we have the Big Four. And if we're thinking to yourself, who are the Big Four again? If you're thinking of Woodrow Wilson representing the United States, Vittorio Orlando representing Italy, David Lloyd George representing the United Kingdom or Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau representing France, you would be correct. And what did these Big Four, what did they determine? They determined that Germany was accepting the blame for starting the war. So Germany was signing that war guilt clause. They were accepting and creating this League of Nations. Ironically, this man's idea, Woodrow Wilson, this was his 14th point of his 14 points. And yet ironic that the United States did not join, which might have led to why it failed. Story for another day. And what else did these four gentlemen decide? They decided that Germany was responsible for paying reparations. We know about $33 billion in today's monetary amount. And also that Germany was losing its military and its territory, both in Europe as well as its Asian and African colonies. So where does that leave the war? Or I'm sorry, where does that leave peace and the Paris Peace Conference? What are the results of this? We know that England and France are really happy. Italy, less so. They wanted more. They didn't get as much. Same thing with Japan. We'll hear more about that in subsequent weeks. And we also know that Germany is super bitter. And we know that the League of Nations is established. However, this is not the only results and effects of the war. But wait, there's more. Ooh, look, that was a rhyme. I'm a poet and I don't even know it. So what are the other big post-war developments? One of the biggest developments is the creation of new nations. We are going to see so many new nations created in Europe that had not been in existence prior. Why does this happen? Because in Europe, we had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And by the end of the war, all of those empires have disappeared, which leaves space for the creation of new nations. And remember, nationalism, this pride in one's culture and heritage, as well as the belief that countries should be based off national connection, cultural connections, and not just because of divine right, it's going to inspire the creation of many new states, which prior to this had been part of large empires. So the Central Powers, they're going to break up, primarily dissolve, and create new nations. So starting up here in the north, out of most of Eastern Germany, we're going to have the creation of Poland. Now, Poland is interesting because unlike the rest of these nations, Poland is not a new nation. In fact, Poland had been in existence for several centuries, up until the Napoleonic Wars. At the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, as part of the treaties that kind of established peace back in Europe for 100 odd years. Out of those discussions and out of those agreements came the basically ignoring and dissolution of Poland. Poland stopped existing, and the Polish people, those in the West, became part of the German Empire, and those in the East became part of the Russian Empire. And poor Poland did not exist. But hooray, it's back. It only took 105 years, and Poland is back in business, ready to just be all over that map as they continue to this day. Go Poland. All right, out of Austria-Hungary, we are going to see the creation of a couple new states. So we're going to see the creation of Czechoslovakia, the creation of Austria, Hungary, aptly named, as well as the nation of Yugoslavia. Now, if you look at a map of Europe today in 2020, you are only going to see Austria and Hungary because Czechoslovakia is going to break up into the Czech Republic, although they've changed their name last year, and now they're Czechia, and Slovakia. And Yugoslavia is going to break up into several nations like Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and North Macedonia. It used to be known as Macedonia, but they have a big issue with Greece. It's a whole story. We can talk about that another day. But from about 1919 till about 1991, Yugoslavia is its own nation. So these are all coming out of Austria-Hungary. And then out of the Ottoman Empire, we're going to see the new nation of Turkey being established. So the Ottoman Empire, which had at one point gone all the way up into Europe, now is established as Turkey, as well as the Arab mandates that we'll see on the next slide. Now, the Allied powers are also going to create some new countries. The Russian Empire is going to both lose some land as well as go through a change. So, first of all, out of that Russian Revolution that we've talked about a little bit and we'll get more into next week, out of this Russian Revolution, we have the establishment of the Soviet Union, or USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We're also going to see the creation of Finland, that had been part of the Russian Empire up here in the Baltic region, as well as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. If you're wondering where Mr. V is, our chemistry teacher, he is living in Latvia right now. And then, of course, Poland, because Russia had given up some of its land as part of that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk to get out of the war. That's what's going to help Poland create. Finally, one other new nation that's created, not so much because of dissolution of empire, but somewhat as a result of World War I, is going to be the Republic of Ireland, the fine Irish country, Ireland, over here west of Great Britain. They're finally going to gain their independence despite clamoring for it for centuries. That's a story for another day. All right, as I just mentioned, we also see some new nations created in the Middle East. What's happening in the Middle East? And when we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about modern day with Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, that whole region. And don't worry, I'll show you some maps in the next couple slides. So what had happened was during World War I, the British, as well as the French, went to the Arab lands and they went to the people there. They went to many of the Arab citizens and said, look, if you fight with us against the Central Powers, against the Ottoman Empire, who were Ottoman Turks who had a different culture, different heritage, so once again, inspired by that nationalism, and the English go to the Arab people and say, look, if you fight with us and if you help us defeat the Ottomans, we'll give you independence. Doesn't that sound amazing? You can have your own nation based off your own cultural heritage, your own cultural values, just really embracing that nationalism. And the Arabs are like, that's amazing. We are here for it. This is also going to be one of the factors that's going to lead, as we talked about the Armenian genocide. The Ottomans feared that the Armenians were also fighting against them, which was part of the reason, although I would also say there's just blind hatred and lots of other problematic issues that's going to lead to that really painful and horrible time in the Armenian experience. So the Ottomans are really worried that people are fighting against them. So the Arabs, they agree to it. They're like, we're into it. We're here for it. We will join up. And they join the Allied powers and they fight with the Allies against the Ottomans. Now, when the war is over, the Arabs go to England. They go to France. They're like, hey, we did it. Isn't that so great? We fought with you. And we are ready for independence. And the Allied powers say, about that, not so quick. Instead, they're like, you know what? We're going to give you independence, but we're going to guide you because we can't trust you to be totally independent on your own, which is a total break of promise. So, and as you can imagine, that would lead to a lot of frustration. So what's going to happen is France and England, they are basically going to split up these new nations that are formed. France is going to get Syria and Lebanon up in the north, and England is going to control Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. We will talk more about this when we start looking at the Middle East more in depth, but it's important to note that at no point did they question the Arab peoples. At no point did they consider cultural boundaries or heritage or anything of that sort. And instead, they basically just created the modern map of the Middle East without considering anyone in the Middle East, which is one of the reasons why we continue to see problems in that region, especially tensions between Middle Eastern nations and Western powers. In the first half of the century, we're going to see a lot of frustration towards England and France because of the creation and continued control of mandates, but that will then shift to the United States in the latter half of the century and continuing to this day. But again, story for another day. So we see this creation of these new nations. All right, let's get some images because for us visual learners, we got some maps to look at. So here we have a map of Europe prior to the war. So we see the Russian Empire taking over all this land. We see Germany, all this land. We see Austria-Hungary all over here and the Ottoman Empire. And of course, don't sleep on Luxembourg because they're there too. All right, and then looking at the map of Europe after World War One, we see a lot of change. So whereas this had all been part of Russia, now we see its own independent nations: Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. And whereas this had been Austria-Hungary, this whole space, now we see Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. And then the same thing in the Middle East. So the Ottoman Empire had controlled this Anatolian plateau, as well as this more traditional Middle Eastern, the cradle civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates, going back to like sixth grade history, as well as quite a bit of the empire going into the Arabian Peninsula. So the Ottoman Empire controlled quite a bit of land, but by 1922, the Ottoman Empire has gone by the wayside and has been replaced by Turkey. And then following with the French-controlled Syria and Lebanon, these small two nations, and the British-controlled Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. You can see here on these dates, this is when these mandates finally gained independence, despite being promised decades prior. And then Saudi Arabia is also going to be created, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But again, we'll get more into that when we start looking at the Middle East more intensely. But story, what's the big takeaway here? A lot of new nations are formed. Sometimes they are not given the correct foundation to be effective and to be good leaders for their governments and their peoples, which is going to lead to conflict in the rest of the 20th century. All right, one other way to look at it, because if there's one thing I love, it's maps. So here we have a global map of the empires. We can kind of see who are our big power players. Of course, Russian Empire controlling so much land. We also have the French in pink here controlling a good chunk of Africa, as well as having some presence here in Asia as well. We see that the Belgians are having some presence. Here we have our German colonies, so controlling a lot of Africa, as well as they have a little bit here in Asia. And we see that the Dutch are hanging out, as well as the Italians, and the Spanish are even there. And then, of course, our biggest empire is that sun that's never setting, the British Empire controlling Canada, a little bit over here in South America, a lot of Africa, and quite a bit of Asia, and even into Oceania. So those British, they're just controlling so much. After the war, we're going to see some change. So what had been Germany now has gone to the French and other allied powers. Japan really wanted to control more. They were pretty bitter that they did not get more of this land, but they are going to get all up in Manchuria, as we'll see, and that's going to start pretty quickly after the end of World War I. And we see that England is still controlling a whole lot of land, but that is definitely going to change. All right, and then finally, thinking about this, we know that World War I is a global war, which means that we are sending citizens from around these continents, from all these colonies, are fighting this war. They're also going to be inspired by a lot of those decisions that follow the war. So the other big takeaway, we have these new nations in Europe, we have these new nations in the Middle East, but we still also have a lot of colonies. And these colonial subjects are going to say, hello, we're seeing new nations being formed in other parts of the world. Why are there not new nations being formed in our parts of the world? So they're inspired by this concept of self-determination. Now remember, self-determination is the belief that people should choose for themselves what type of government, what type of state they should have. So they should get to say who is going to be in their government and how their government is set up. They should get to determine what their borders are, which means that they should not be a colony. It flies in the face of colonization. Which is ironic because, as we know, this is an American idea, but at this time, America is actually growing its empire. Colonial subjects, so they're inspired by self-determination. They're also super frustrated because many of them, millions of them, also died from this war. And for many of them, they were promised things like independence or greater freedoms, and for their sacrifices, they're given nothing. So they're like, you know what? Let's start demanding independence. Why not? Because we deserve it. And we're going to see this starting in India with Gandhi. He's actually going to start this fight for independence shortly after the end of World War I. We're also going to see things like the Amritsar massacre, in which people protested and was met with bloody and brutal resistance. It still is an important event in Indian history. In Vietnam against the French, a young man by the name of Ho Chi Minh is going to start advocating for Vietnamese independence. We're going to hear all about Uncle Ho when we start looking at the Cold War, because he is going to establish Vietnam in later dates. So just a little spoiler alert. And in Iraq and Palestine, those mandates, we're going to see several revolts against the British. Very frustrated, very upset with the British control of the mandates. So finally, what are the results of this conflict? We see that millions are disillusioned with their previous beliefs. If we remember, people were like excited to go to war. They were like, this war is going to be fast. It's going to be awesome. We can't wait to dive in. And then what are they met with? They're met with the brutality of trench warfare, the brutality of these new weapons, poison gas, of the utter terror of this conflict, the massive amounts of death. 20s of million people die from this conflict. So this whole belief, they really start questioning. And they start questioning their beliefs about governments, about the concept of progress, everything that came out of the Enlightenment. We can just rationalize and make things better. People are like, maybe not so much. And even the concept of nationalism. So there really is a period of time in which people are questioning everything. And we're going to look more at this in class on Friday with the concept of the lost generation. Why is this happening? Because we're having millions of people returning with shell shock, what we determine later as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So people literally do not know how to function. We also are going to see ethnic minorities being forced into new states because, again, they were not really addressed when the creation of the new states were created. So we're going to see conflicts arising, especially in Yugoslavia. Spoiler alert for the end of the century. And then we're also going to see in the Middle East, in Africa, and Asia, these subjects of colonies and the mandates are going to start demanding independence. It's going to take them a couple more decades, but they're going to get there, as we shall see. And finally, what's our final result? Peace. It's achieved for maybe 20 years. But we know that that is not going to last for long, as illustrated by this lovely cartoon here. Here we have Woodrow Wilson serenading, conducting a song for everlasting peace. But we have our wonderful allied powers here, Japan, England, France, and Italy, all promising to sing along. The US is there as well. But what do they have in their back pockets? That's not something you use for peace. And on that note, I will leave you. We will talk more about these disillusioned millions in class on Friday. I hope you're enjoying your asynchronous day, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.